So, welcome to this month's edition of Scalefusion podcast, Partner Perspectives. We've got Chad Nordby from TRG. Chad, I got to look at my notes, to be honest. I got to make sure because you got a long title here. So I want to make sure I get it right. So Chad Nordby, Director of Enterprise Services and Global Alliances with TRG. Welcome to the Scalefusion podcast.
Thanks, Steve. Pleasure to be here this afternoon.
Yeah, we made it happen, man. I know we had some technical difficulties getting started, but we're happy to get this recorded and shared with our audience. So, Chad, I want to just start out. Could you introduce yourself and kind of what you do and what TRG does? Let's start with that.
Yeah, I'd be happy to. So let's start with TRG, and then I'll kind of dive into my background a little bit. So TRG is part of a private group of companies based out of Cleveland, Ohio. We've been in business. Actually, our anniversary was this month, 21 years now. So we got started in the ruggedized side of the business, traditionally known as supply chain, doing a lot of work around ruggedized devices, scanning, etc. You fast forward to today, and we have spanned the entire enterprise from supply chain to your front of house enterprise side, everything from iPhones to Android to Samsung devices, really any connected endpoint. We provide a full lifecycle managed service around today. We operate 7 facilities out of 5 different countries, and our core footprint really focuses around the United States, Canada, and Europe. So excited to talk further. We could go on and on about TRG, but I'll leave it there for the moment.
Well, I would just add that you guys have a tremendous team and a tremendous facility and company. I've had the privilege of going to visit and everything, and I'm still happy to work with you guys, even though you're from Ohio and I'm from Michigan. Or like the company's in Ohio and I'm from Michigan. There's this U of M versus Ohio State thing, but still worth working with you guys, and I don't let the rivalry get in the way of working with great partners. So
Well, so I'm not entirely sure what you're referring to, because being from Austin, Texas myself, having grown up in Minnesota, I thought momentarily you were referring to the continual dominance of the Detroit Lions by the Green Bay Packers. But
yeah,
if this is Ohio, Michigan thing, we can certainly talk about that too.
This is the year to be talking about the Lions as well, but that's for another podcast. So, um, sorry to derail that, but thanks for the great explanation on TRG, and probably more specifically, what about you? What's your role look like, and what keeps you busy these days within TRG?
Yeah, sure. So, as you said, I'm our Director of Enterprise Services and Global Alliances. So, I spend my day thinking about how to deliver these lifecycle services for our clients on any type of endpoint. Again, from an Android device to a ruggedized device to a kiosk, etc. Anywhere in the world that our clients are doing business. So I focus a lot on our not only our in-house operations in Europe and North America, but also working with our strategic partners around the world to provide our clients with a single global managed service.
Gotcha. And how would you say that's unique or different, or what kind of challenges do you guys tackle on a global scale that are different than what you see companies dealing with that are just domestic here in the US?
Sure. So, I mean, global really is an extension of what you have in U.S. operations, but where it gets very nuanced very quickly is many organizations, even if they are multinational, even if it's in North America or Europe or spanning the larger globe down into Latin America, Asia Pac, etc., you run into a couple of key differentiating factors that come into play. Typically in the US, your stakeholder has a mandate for the entire country, so they can implement policies that impact all 50 states. When you start about going global, though, in many cases, you don't necessarily have a stakeholder, or they're different stakeholders who will have a global remit. So it's not uncommon to be working with an organization that may make decisions and policies on a regional or national basis. And so that's one aspect that you have to deal with. But also from a rest of world perspective, you are dealing with very different cultural situations depending on what country you're in. You're obviously dealing with language barriers that come into play, and quite frankly, a one size fits all US model has a lot of resistance in other areas around the world. In many cases, the business drivers and concerns, for example, in a Singapore versus a France versus a Brazil or even a Mexico, are wildly different than what key stakeholders in the executive suite may be focusing on in the United States.
Yeah, I can't even imagine the complexity. I mean, like you said, the decision making's got to be much more fragmented, or a lot of different stakeholders that are calling the shots to put together a global solution. And you're probably dealing with different types of uh, data and privacy laws in each country, or what you can do, in those type of deployments too. Um, how do you I mean, how do you guys do that? How do you how do you keep track of all of that? How do you manage it? I know that's a softball question lobbed up there, but I mean, like, that's pretty impressive to be able to manage all of that complexity.
Well, if I gave you all the secret details, I may be out of a job. Uh, but no, the reality really is that it's being cognizant of the different regions and stakeholders within the organization, and what those cultural realities are, and making sure that everyone has a voice and is heard in the process. Otherwise, you end up with two kind of common results. Either the US throws up their hands and says, I'm done with the rest of the world. You go figure it out the way you want to do it, in which case you get no standardization, you get no economies of scale, you don't get many of these benefits. Um, or you end up in a program that is rolled out, but it's either circumvented or gets a lot of regional pushback. So
Mm.
it's really being understanding of those different markets and those different realities, and working with the organization to do a couple of things. When you go global, nobody serves 195 countries around the world. They just don't. So you really end up in kind of this 80-20, 90-10 rule. And so you're focusing on those key areas of the organization, but it's also important to realize that perfect is the enemy of good enough.
Yeah.
In that you can spend a lot of time trying to come up with the perfect model, when the reality is there's a lot of areas for incremental improvement in efficiencies and cost savings for these organizations without necessarily solving 100% of the puzzle.
Gotcha. Yeah, and that's probably a good segue into my next question. Was more customer driven. Like, what type of trends or like projects are you seeing companies asking for? And is it the same that it's been in the last 5 years, or are you starting to see different types of projects come across your desk?
Yeah, so it's an excellent question. It's a yes and no. So there's two interesting trends. What one is similar around the world as well as the United States, and then there's an interesting area where large portions of the United States have diverged away from rest of world. So on the one hand, we are finally seeing this mobile first type of IT approach is really starting to explode in many areas. So Mobile World Congress in Barcelona last year, there was a number of excellent examples from Italy and Germany and various areas where these organizations are realizing that their workforce today, your 20 and 30 something group, they grew up on mobile devices. That's
Yeah,
their
yeah.
world. And so not only do they expect those to get their job done, but they just don't relate to a laptop PC centric type of world. So that, in concert with the fact that mobility a long time ago passed that milestone of general saturation for that nice to have smartphone, where we're doing some email, we're watching Disney Plus, at the airport, give it to your kids, you're browsing, doing Amazon Prime and what have you. So in conjunction with uh, this kind of democratization and mobility in this mobile first, we're really seeing line of business or business purpose devices being deployed as a tool. And as a tool, they're not just nice to have anymore. These are devices that are essential for the employee to get their work done. I mean, there's obvious examples that we see in the airline industry where flight attendants and pilots literally can't function without their mobile device.
Yeah.
We're seeing other areas in healthcare, for example, where if they don't have their tablet, things come to a screeching halt. But I think the biggest divergence that we're seeing in rest of the world versus the United States, and we've been seeing this escalate more and more over the last 10 years, is there's a very high level of awareness, not only in the threat, but also in taking active steps to mitigate it around mobile security. And when I
Mm.
say mobile security, I'm not talking simply an MDM policy, but I'm talking the marrying of MDM with anti-malware and anti-cyber threat types of solutions, as the rest of the world increasingly sees mobile as one of their primary threat vectors. And for some reason, in the United States, I have numerous theories behind it, but in the United States, mobile malware and cybersecurity protection still flies under the radar. I was just talking to a chief information security officer the other day, and they just don't see it as a primary threat. Still very much focused on server patching, firewall, more of those traditional areas.
Yeah, yeah, it's really interesting. We're seeing that gap as well. We obviously have, partners and customers asking to uh, have us help along those lines and integrate with those other types of tools, which we do. But it still seems secondary, like for most people in the U.S. here, it's not like a top of mind. I wouldn't say on the mobile security side of things. Um,
Yeah. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
no, go ahead. Go ahead.
Yeah. Another interesting trend that is many stakeholders in the U.S. tend to be blind to, is that your Western countries, the U.S. and in many cases your Commonwealth countries, iOS has a disproportionate share in the enterprise. But when you go rest of the world, iOS does not have that same disproportionate market share.
Hmm.
And so the tools to address Android at a very granular level are in higher demand in rest of the world than they tend to be in the U.S. market. Um,
Yeah.
the other thing that we see in many areas, this has been true in Europe for a long time too, is either an active or passive pushback on some of the very U.S. centric solutions. And so we'll see pushback around Intune or pushback around VMware in some areas of the market, in the global market, that you don't necessarily get here. And
Hmm.
so it definitely opens up different lanes and different preferences in different markets for how they're addressing not only device management, but device security issues.
That's interesting. I mean, do you think that's just because that's like you said, they that's they don't want to be put in the box. They want some more agility. They want to craft a more complex solution, or just not that cookie cutter, uh, you know, go to name that the U.S. is. defaulting to sometimes, or what do you think the what's driving that?
I think that's part of it, but if you take a look at the open source community, the open source has had far deeper roots and larger success in Europe than it ever had in the US. Culturally, that lends itself more towards Android in where people lean. But I think the number one driver in reality is that the Android ecosystem covers a very wide array of price points. And
Yeah,
so if the we just had new iPhones rolled out, what, last week, or I think so. Um, but take a look at the price points, and now take a look at many of the countries that multinationals are operating in. Whether it's across Middle East, Africa, Asia Pacific, and what have you, and you have far more countries that have a far lower average GDP than you would have in the US or in a number of other markets. And so this simple default of I'm going to upgrade to a new $1,000, $800 iPhone every 12 to 24 months is just not it
it's
it
not viable,
it
right?
right. Absolutely, it's not viable. And there are still people or corporations in the States that have contracts where they're like, well, we're only paying 99 cents for the iPhone. Well, yeah, it's all buried somewhere else, right? It's still a 600, $800,000 phone. And that's reality that many of these other markets are dealing with.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. When you look at it that way, the diversity of that hardware choice is one, like you said, the price points on Android and the various form factors, functionalities. There's a lot more flexibility, I think, with Android. But for us, and maybe you can shed some light on this, because you alluded to some organizations in the U.S. or even globally just pick one standard device and that's it. You're getting iPhone or you're getting Android. What would you say the percentage of you know businesses you're working with that are just strictly one piece of hardware versus those that have mixed environments that are actually trying to manage a lot of different types of devices?
It's always tough to put a number to that, but from a multinational perspective, it's exceptionally rare that you see an organization mandate one platform globally. You may see that in industries like finance. You may see that in certain segments of transportation and what have you. But generally, you'll see a mix. Uh, it also depends on the sector of the organization. So in your ruggedized space, it's dominated by Android, and so that's simply a
Yeah,
fact. So in airlines, the classic example, they tend to have this terminology of below the wing and above the wing, right? Below the wing is maintenance, it's flight ops, it's baggage handling, and what have you. That's absolutely dominated by Android. But if you get it above the wing, so inside of the plane of any of your major US carriers and many of your international carriers, that's dominated by iOS. So to a certain extent, it ends up being the use case. There is a fact about iOS slash iPad OS that has been true for a long time, and that is from a CIO perspective, when an OS release comes out, it comes out simultaneously for the entire world and all the devices, and and you can manage that entire fleet much easier than sometimes you can on the Android side, where you're not dealing with unlocked devices, but in many cases, you're dealing with devices where patch and OS updates are dictated by the carrier. So when they're dictated by the carrier, so Samsung unlocked devices exception to the rule, right?
right.
Google Pixel the exception to the rule. But for many of the devices, from a security and patching perspective, that ends up getting very difficult. And we do work with organizations that gatekeep their environment on an N-1 or N-2 OS perspective. And so they'll simply block devices from accessing corporate resources once they age past that N-1 or N-2. And in a very heterogeneous environment with a lot of different manufacturers across a lot of different geographies, that gets interesting. I mean, we run
Mhm.
a 24/7 multilingual end user help desk, and in those environments, we'll get the IT dictate that's coming out, but then we get the flood of telephone calls when invariably people deleted that email, forgot about it, and all of a sudden their devices are being bounced off of the corporate resources.
Yeah, I can imagine. It's got to be very very complex when or you're gonna know there's an issue. Let's just say that, right? And when you do that software update, you're gonna know pretty quickly if there's an issue or not because you guys are gonna be getting phone calls.
Absolutely.
Um, so shifting gears a little bit to like we've talked about you guys do the whole life cycle management. I mean you're starting from procurement to managing the devices to bringing them back in and all everywhere in between, right? So obviously there's a component of an MDM like ours involved. This isn't necessarily a scale fusion commercial or anything, but I'm curious of what you're looking for. Because you manage a lot of different MDMs. I'm familiar. Uh, what are you looking for? What are your customers asking for in that space for a management tool to for these type of deployments, these type of global deployments that you guys are working on?
Sure. So that that's an excellent question, and I don't want to dive into uh, your side of the business in the engineering side. I'll talk about it
Right.
more from
Yes,
our
that's what I
side,
mean.
right?
From the business driver side, like what are or like the what are those stakeholders asking for? Because in my experience, a lot of times the decision makers don't really care how it happens or which MDM is being used or whatever. They're just saying, I want it to be able to do this. These are the things I want, or I want to either restrict or enable, and go figure it out and do it. And I'm just kind of curious what you're hearing from your opportunities.
Yeah, so it really comes down to not the feature list, because from a feature list perspective, it seems like everyone checks the same boxes in many cases, right? It's the execution of those features. And so we see this in a couple of areas. We see it in the actual bootstrapping or enrollment of the devices into the MDM platform. And in a perfect world, whether we're using Apple Business Manager or Android Zero Touch, that communication between those platforms and the MDM and the subsequent device wizard for the enrollment, that just happens seamlessly. But I can certainly tell you from feedback from our operations people, that's not the case, especially in what I'll call that fast follower or long tail segment of the MDM market. And when that starts to go off the tracks, that starts to cause a lot of enrollment problems that hit operations. Or if you're truly embracing the zero touch, zero um, pre configuration or deployment, where the devices are going directly to the end user, it creates frustration on the employee level, and it drives calls to your help desk, and frustration and calls generates friction, which generates costs. So that's not good. The other area that's very critical is that it's the ease of creating and deploying policies. So many organizations, as they're rolling out new lines of business, or they are tailoring to different regions or segments, need to be able to make policy changes or create new policies, or do scripting, and many of the tools out there are not efficient or friendly in how that's done. So the ability to make changes quickly, test them, and deploy them out into the active user population, those are critical. And like I said, they don't show up on paper, but the
Yeah.
lack of them, or the efficiency and effectiveness of them, absolutely shows up in practice.
Yeah, I think it's sometimes hard to quantify that, but we hear that very often when people try our product. We can do the same thing as, another MDM, but they'll be like, "Hey, this took me 2 clicks on Scalefusion and it took me 12 on, another competitor." And that adds up. All like you said, the ease of use and being able to do things efficiently and make those changes quickly is huge, and it impacts the customer experience, impacts the bottom line, like you alluded to. Like all of these small components add up into really big impact on the customers.
Oh, it does. I mean, everything that we do is at the margin. And what I mean by that is it's efficiencies at the margin, it's improving processes at the margin, it's improving the end user experience. These are all the areas that we work with our clients to deliver on the experience. And so, to your point, if you can go from 4 clicks to two or what have you, that that drives not only cost savings but it impacts the end user experience, which is actually an interesting point. We definitely saw this during the COVID period and now the post period, is that mobility is increasingly becoming a employee benefits, not the right term. It's becoming part of the employee experience,
Yeah.
and choice is driving it as part of the experience. Apple loves to hear that since they've been behind the employee choice mantra for a while. But it really goes all the way down to when a employee gets their device. It's part of that unboxing experience. It's part of that, I have my new device or I'm a new employee, and this is part of me becoming part of that corporate organization. And so how that goes on everything from the packaging to the presentation to how seamlessly they're up and running, this is now not an area of just IT, it's an area of HR, and it's an area of retention, and it's an area of branding. So anything that is not efficient or or not seamless, then is simply a drag or friction on that experience.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. We could probably keep talking about this for a long time, Chad, but I know like we're gonna try to keep our time short here to 20, 30 minutes so it's digestible for everyone. So I guess I'm just gonna loft another softball question up here to you. Any last thoughts on what we're talking about to kind of wrap things up? I know we covered a lot from the customer experience to the monetary decision making and the stakeholders and all that on the global side of things. Anything you want to wrap things up with? Final thoughts, and then also, how does somebody get a hold of you if they had questions, if they want to do business with you or just learn more?
Sure. So at the end of the day, I think when we're talking about a one country organization to a multi-country organization, it really comes down to businesses local and being able to address what those local requirements are. But it's also very much in the quality of the partners that you're working with. And whether it's working with an organization like yours, whether it's working with other organizations in the ecosystem, it's really about partnering to drive that business success. Because it inside of an organization, if mobility is just a nice to have, it's just about watching TikTok or what have you, then collectively our services are not critical. But if these devices are business essential and mission critical to serving customers and getting the job done, then you want to make sure you're partnering with the right organizations out there. As far as learning more about TRG or getting in contact with us, we can certainly be found at trgsolutions.com. Also, we can certainly put my contact information on the screen if anyone is interested from there. Always happy to talk about what we're seeing globally, and some of the best practices around multinational and regional enterprise mobility programs.
Yeah, definitely. We'll be sure to link your info here, Chad, in case anybody wants to connect with you. I just wanted to thank you again for being on our show. I appreciate all the insights. I know you guys are experts at what you do, and I appreciate the global perspective too, because I think sometimes, when a guy like me who's wearing that North America hat is looking at creating partnerships. Usually within the US, I know it reaches globally too. So it's great to have that perspective. So appreciate you sharing
I
it and being on the show.
Yeah, I appreciate being here. Luckily, we never have to figure out how to find you. You are the most prolific LinkedIn poster I know. So I look forward to the next chapter of that tomorrow. But
Thanks,
otherwise,
man.
thank you very much for being here.
You'll be on it, I'm sure, once we release the podcast. So I'll be glad to feature you. So
All
all
right,
right,
looking
thanks a
forward
lot,
to it.
Chad. And
Yep.
everyone else, please tune in next month. We'll have another a podcast for you. Thanks.
Thanks, Steve.